Chapter 5 James Thomas On the second day of school, James Thomas Dalton ran in late. JT, which was what everyone called him, was tall and blond and played football too. He had blue eyes and a dimple on his chin, and his nose was just slightly off center. I thought it made him look even more handsome. Like half the girls in my class, I had a crush on him. Not that anyone else knew. I hadn't even told Judy. It was embarrassing to like someone who still didn't know his times tables. But JT had flair. He had confidence. That and a really long eyelashes. My brother's car had a flat, JT announced to everyone, and no one in particular. I had to help change it. Miss Taylor nodded in sympathy. I'll excuse you this time. JT grinned at her, and his smile blinded us all to the fact that there wasn't a bit of grease or dirt on his clothes. The only open seat was next to me, so he strode over and threw his bag down. Hi, Marley, he said. Of course he knew my name. We'd been in school together since we were 6, but it still gave me a thrill. I smiled back and tried to move my bag out of his way, but I bumped it instead. 4 or 5 new pencils rolled out across the floor. Sally giggled as I gathered them up. JT handed me one of the pencils and our fingers touched, and I could almost hear the wedding bells. Even though we were in homeroom, Miss Taylor couldn't help giving us a preview of what we were going to do in history that afternoon. She started going on and on about Arkansas and how we'd each pick a topic and give a presentation in class. Pretty soon I stopped listening. Sally would ask me to be her partner, and I'd do all the work. That's how it always was. Besides, I was having too much fun imagining my life with JT. By lunchtime, I'd planned our honeymoon in Italy and was trying to decide if we should name our first son Orbit or Cosine when someone slid into the chair beside me. I just about spit out my peanut butter and jelly sandwich when I realized it was JT. Hi, Marley, he said. I knew I should squeeze out a hi or maybe a hello or maybe even hello JT, but of course he knew what his name was and my mouth was full of peanut butter. Still, I'd promised Judy I'd try to speak, so before I could talk myself out of it, I said, Hi, JT. I was pleased. I sounded so smooth and calm, at least until I reached for my milk to wash down the peanut butter and knocked over the carton instead. JT, always the gentleman, mopped up the mess. I was wondering if you'd be willing to help me with my math this year, he said, as he pushed a pile of soggy napkins around the table. I was too surprised to move. There was still a big blob of peanut butter stuck to the roof of my mouth. If I said something, JT would be totally grossed out. Mr. Harding is a hard teacher, JT went on. I'm sure to fail if I don't find a tutor, and I don't want to have to repeat the 7th grade like my brother did. I'm not so good at math, and you're great at it. So, what do you say? Do you want to help me? I swallowed. This was my chance. I do. He grinned, pulled out his math book, and handed it to me. The first assignment is on page 12, numbers 1 through 21. I knew that. We were in the same class. Still, I didn't mind being the brains in the family. Let's meet up before school tomorrow, and you can explain it to me, he suggested. Say, at the picnic table by the football field? I nodded. He patted me on the shoulder. Thanks, Marley, he said. You're a real sweet girl. Then he walked off to join his friends at the regular table. I was on cloud 9. I had a date, a real date with JT. We'd had a whole conversation. He liked me. He just wants you to do the work for him, Sally said, sitting down at our table. I shrugged. I was happy, and I wasn't going to let Sally take that away from me. Maybe, said Liz, as she put down her tray, but he sure is cute. I didn't hear the rest of the conversation after that. I was too busy about Cosine and his little sister Isosceles. The next morning I had Daddy drop me off at school extra early. I had pencils, paper, both our math books, and my homework. JT could use it as an answer key if he got stuck. He wasn't at school when I arrived, so I sat down on top of the picnic table to wait. I waited a long time. Cosine and Isosceles were in college by the time JT's brother, Red, finally pulled up to the curb. JT might be a cup of hot chocolate with whipped cream and sprinkles on top, but his brother was castor oil. Red was 17, a year older than Judy. He had blonde hair and blue eyes, like his little brother, and his features were so regular they looked like they had been laid out with a ruler. If you ask me, it's people's imperfections that give them character. A nose slightly off center, or a dimple, or one ear slightly higher than the other. There was something creepy about Red's perfect symmetrical face. Or maybe it wasn't about his face at all. Once, when we were all little kids playing in an old quarry near our house, Red had called me over to see a butterfly he'd caught. It was beautiful, black and orange, and fluttered like a tiny pulsing heart in his hand. Then suddenly, he'd torn off its wings with its fingertips and laughed when I started to cry. "You got the mute girl tutoring you?" asked Red loudly as he pulled up to the curb. I knew he wanted me to hear. JT shrugged. "She's pretty and good at math. What else do I need?" He opened the door and got out. Red sped off, almost hitting one of the colored women who worked in the cafeteria and was trying to cross the street. He leaned on the horn and she hurried out of his way. I wanted to say something to her as she walked toward the side door of the school. "Are you all right? Isn't he a jerk?" Or maybe even just, "Hello," but before I could get up the nerve, she was inside the building and the moment was gone. "Hi, Marley." JT sat down next to me on the picnic bench. I smiled at him. "So," said JT. "So, I guess I'd have to say something. In my excitement over planning the JT and Marley love story, I'd forgotten that tutoring him would involve actual speaking." "You ready?" he asked. I opened my math book and my homework fell out. The first bell rang. Great, we only had 5 minutes to get to class. There were 21 problems. We'd never finish in time. But JT's grin was as wide as ever. "You're a sweetheart." Before I could swoon over his words of endearment, JT picked up my homework and put it in his book. He winked and slammed the book shut. "Thanks, Marley. See you, same place tomorrow. Okay?" He strode off without waiting for an answer. All yesterday I'd imagined the scene. JT and I would have so much fun working together. He'd say he wanted to spend more time with me. We'd do fractions at the Double Scoop ice cream parlor and long division at Crystal Burger. I wanted to believe the best of him. Maybe he'd had another flat tire. Maybe his alarm clock hadn't gone off. Even though the truth was staring me in the face, I couldn't help thinking that maybe tomorrow he'd be on time. Chapter 6. A New Partner. I spent all of homeroom frantically doing my math homework again. When I was done, Liz leaned over and whispered, "What are you going to do for your history report?" For a minute, I didn't know what she was talking about. Then I remembered the project Miss Taylor had told us about yesterday, the one that involved an oral presentation. No wonder I'd done my best to block it out. Liz kept talking, "Because I had this really good idea, and I wanted to ask you to work with me." I glanced at Sally. Liz saw who I was looking at and her face dropped, but she pasted a smile back on so fast, if I'd blinked, I'd have missed her true reaction. "Oh, of course," she said brightly. "That makes sense. You and Sally being old friends and all." I suddenly knew she'd imagined this scene just like I had imagined the one with JT, and this wasn't the way hers had ended, either. I felt bad, but not bad enough to actually work with her. Liz turned away, but as she did, she knocked her math notebook on the floor. I bent over to pick it up. On the back was a square, with lots of little squares in it, and some of the squares were numbers. I knew what it was. It was a magic square. Magic squares have been around for just about forever. According to David's old math book, he used to let me read it when he wasn't studying. The Chinese discovered them way back before Jesus was even born. The simplest was a 3x3 square with the numbers 1 to 9 arranged so that every row, column, and diagonal added up to 15. Liz had a 4x4 square on her notebook with some of the numbers missing. I ran my fingers over the numbers. The top row added to 34. "It's a magic square," said Liz, sounding a little embarrassed. "It's a silly game my mother taught me." 13, I said, pointing to a blank square. "Oh," said Liz. "Thanks, I couldn't figure that one out." I stared at the square again. Yep, each row, column, and diagonal added up to 34. It was beautiful. I handed back the notebook and counted 2, 3, 5, 7. What was your idea? Well, I have this book about the founding of Little Rock and the Indians who used to live here, and Liz paused and looked at me. Then she shook her head. It's okay, Marley. You don't have to pretend to be interested. It's just. I took a deep breath. Why me? Liz shrugged. You seem like a hard worker. At my school, I was the one who always ended up doing all the work. I knew what that was like. I'd worked with Sally on every project since third grade. Maybe it was time for a change. Okay, I said. Really? She asked. I nodded. Great, she said. Meet you at the public library tomorrow after school? I nodded again. The bell rang and homeroom was over. Liz gave me a little wave and walked off. What was she? A root beer? An extra thick milkshake with 2 straws? Carrot juice? I didn't know, and I didn't really care. I just wanted to know everything she knew about magic squares. On Friday, I arrived early and waited by the picnic table, and again JT arrived just before the bell rang. He winked at me as he took my homework. Like your hair. Jude and I had stayed up late the night before putting my hair into curlers. I knew I should feel mad about the homework, but I couldn't help being just a little tickled he had noticed, and at least this time I'd known to do the homework twice. When I walked into the library that afternoon, there was Liz, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, reading glasses balanced on her nose. When she saw me, she pulled off the glasses and waved. Hi, Marley, she said with a smile. I wasn't sure you'd come. I shrugged. Clearly, she didn't understand how much I liked math. When she realized I wasn't going to answer her, she handed me a book, and I sat down and started reading. We read for a long time. The book she had pulled for me on the Quapaw Indians was actually pretty interesting. The Quapaws were the Indians who had lived in Little Rock when the first settlers came. The book talked all about their families and how they got married and what they did when they died. When I looked up, Liz had 2 pages of notes in a crisp, neat handwriting. Find anything interesting? She asked. I nodded. What? I passed her a book and pointed to a paragraph about what they did with orphan children. She read it quickly. Cool. Hey, we could do this for the class. Put on sort of a pretend ceremony, pick some kids to be the orphans and some others to be the fathers. That would be interesting and more fun than just reading a boring old paper aloud. Only one problem, she said. I looked at her. You have to talk, she said. I mean, during the presentation. I shook my head. I did not talk in front of the class. That was like asking me to walk down the street in my underwear. You have to at least say something. I just looked at her. If I do all the talking, people will think I did all the work, and that's not fair. She was right. It wasn't fair. And I didn't care. I did not give oral presentations. It's important to face your fears, said Liz. It makes you a better person. I thought I was pretty good just the way I was. We stared at each other for a long moment. If it was a staring contest she wanted, I knew I'd win. Sure enough, she looked away first. I tell you what, said Liz. My mother has a whole book about magic squares. You speak during our presentation, and I'll give it to you. Just when I thought I'd gotten the best of her, she went and turned it all around. A book of magic squares? There was no way I could resist that, and from the smug look on her face, I was pretty sure she understood how much I liked math after all. Fine, I said. Liz smiled at me. The front door of the library opened and a couple of colored girls walked in. Liz stiffened. I knew Negroes were allowed to use the library now. That rule had passed a few years ago, but I didn't see them there much. It was like the bus. Officially, anyone could sit anywhere they wanted now, but most of the time the colored folks stayed to the back. I think we've done enough for one day, said Liz, closing her book. She glanced over at the colored girls again. They were waiting, trying unsuccessfully to get the librarian's attention. I wondered if Liz was like some of the other kids at school, calling colored folks names I wasn't allowed to say. I wondered if I could do this project with her if she was. They aren't hurting anyone, I said quietly. I know, she said. I'm just tired of studying. But I didn't quite believe her.